As we continue our study of the book of Exodus, we continue now with Exodus 12, verse 1 through chapter 13, verse 16, a narrative that is probably the most familiar to us, and that is the story of the Passover and the events that take place on the night of the 10th plague. As we begin, we reflect a little bit on the overall and general background of this. We must remember that this is a narrative that really kind of interrupts and introduces the 10th plague. It is really the culmination of all of the events which take place to let the Pharaoh and the people of Israel know that God himself is in charge. And so the explanation will actually say that this is to show that the powers of the gods of Egypt are really not as strong as the power of the Lord himself. The events that take place here, remember, are following that 9th plague. All of these earlier plagues are plagues that many have observed are part of natural types of disasters, but unless one would say that in panic people killed their firstborn son, which the text says nothing about, then we would have to recognize that this is a whole new level. And the people of the country are going to panic at this point, and they are going to say, if we don't get these people out of here, then everyone is going to die. And indeed, the culmination of that takes place, at least in terms of Pharaoh's soldiers, because it will not be very long, but in the very next section that we find described, that indeed Pharaoh and his army will be destroyed. The events that take place here are set, first of all, within the events of a household. One of the things that I think is very critical for us to recognize here, and just recently on television I heard someone, I believe very incorrectly, talking about this. This is not an activity when this animal is sacrificed and eaten which confesses or shows that Israel had to confess its sin to God. First of all, if you were to look into the book of Leviticus and look at the whole sense of whole burnt offerings, which are offerings that are offered when someone has sinned against God, you would notice that no time does anyone eat any of the animal if it is a sin offering, a guilt offering, or as it is usually termed, a whole burnt offering. The kind of offering that a person would eat would be an offering of thanksgiving, a sacrifice of thanking God for the blessings that he has given to the people. This has a whole different kind of context. We recognize that in the New Testament there are a lot of different kinds of concepts that are brought together. But this is not a prefigurement in the form that we have it here. It is not something where one would identify right off the bat that this was a sacrifice that is going to be connected with the final sacrifice of Jesus. What will happen, if anything, is that it is the counter side to that, because while all the Jews at the time of Jesus are celebrating their Passover festival of deliverance from Egypt, the Son, the Lord in the flesh, will be treated as Pharaoh and his hosts. The blood on the doorposts will not be on the cross. So I think it's important to recognize, first of all, even though some people will talk about this as a sacrifice, which in the widest sense of the word, if we're going to talk about taking the life of an animal, it certainly is that. But this is an animal which is being sacrificed or killed in order to strengthen the people for a journey. It is not something that is to expiate or somehow erase the sins of the people. In fact, one of the things that we would notice all the way through is that the Israelites did not go down into Egypt as they later went to southern Iraq in Babylon because they had sinned. God had not pulled them away from the land of Canaan for what they had done wrong, but he had said, I'll give you a place of safety and protection during a famine, and the sins of the Canaanites have not been fulfilled yet. So sometimes talking about 4 generations, sometimes about 400 years or so, there are references to the fact that the people of Israel will be given the land at a much later time. So the general background of this, which I think is very crucial for understanding the text and not mistaking it so that every time blood is shed that sins are being forgiven, is that God's delivering these people from someone else's sin, from the sins of Pharaoh and his host, but there's nothing ever in the text anywhere that suggests that it is for Israel's sin that they have to plead with God not to punish them. In fact, God gives them, through Moses, this insight into how they could put the blood on the doorpost, how they could mark their place as a place where God was dwelling, much as the males would be marked through circumcision as those who were from the covenant. So we have a household, or if a household is too small, a couple of households together that will select either a sheep or a goat. Part of not breaking the bones of that animal would ensure that they were not taking part of that animal and taking it over to some other household. They are to stay inside the house that night. That they will continue and keep it all together is also apparently the reason for the roasting rather than the boiling or something like that, where they might have the parts fall apart. They're to roast it whole, and we've really got two kinds of things that are going on here. Both this ritual with the meat of the animal and the ritual with the unleavened bread, and so there's kind of an interplay between both of these. We're at the time of the year, in the early spring, when two events are taking place. In the time early April or so, you first of all have the land, the grasses and everything beginning to dry up. And from much, much before this time, according to scholars who have tried to study the traditions, the shepherds would be going out at this time of the year to look for summer pasture. Unlike the stories of Heidi, where Heidi goes up into the mountains in Switzerland for the summer and finds pasture there where she can be out in the open. Here, in the spring of the year, as the shepherds would go out, there apparently was a very ancient ritual that they would eat the meat from one animal, and something involved with sacrifice that's hard to determine, but that would be pleading with the gods to watch over them and not let them die during the summer. That's the same time period when the grains now are completing their growing season, what for us would be early, middle, or even late July, when the wheat dries up and is able to be harvested. At that same time, they are gathering brand new grain in the country. And so we have a kind of a merging of two different kinds of traditions. One, the beginning of another harvest with the grain, and the same drying out process, forcing shepherds in that region maybe to go a little farther away from their home to search for pasture that they can use and get at least something from other pasture, and be able then to come back in the fall. So that seems to be the very ancient tradition. The people are told that this 10th plague is coming, this plague of the firstborn, and we can reflect back all the way to at least the story of Isaac, where God says, "Give me your son." Here, probably something of what's going on with this is that awe, that mystery of life in the presence of God, that God is the creator and God is the one who allows life to go on from generation to generation. One of the ways in which the Pharaoh and the people of Egypt would clearly be saying that they didn't think that God was there was that they would say, it's our own activity and our own gods that provide for life to continue, rather than that that would be a gift from the Lord. And so at this point then, as the Lord says, I am going to take the firstborn back, those who have said, I'll take it, I'll control what's mine, I'll think of it as mine, are finally going to see that taken away from them, which they, in other words, hadn't caused. That God's the life giver of man and beast, not just by nature or by chance, not by something that the Pharaoh or his gods could do. So we have, first of all, this plague of the firstborn, And then along with it, this whole connection with the unleavened bread. One of the things about this with the unleavened bread is to remind the people that they had to bake it in haste. If you're going to put yeast in, you may put a little bit of yeast in at nighttime into some fresh dough that you have mixed up, and then you let that sit overnight, and then the next morning you would be able to bake some bread. So part of the idea of unleavened bread is to remind the people they had to bake this very quickly and get ready to go. In fact, they don't even get all of it baked, and they have the dough made, and then they have to gather it together and just put it in some cloths and run with it. So the haste that's involved with the unleavened bread would be remembered every time somebody would say, we didn't even have time to get the bread leavened with yeast. It's also something which would remind them of the brand new crop of wheat that they were just getting in, that was also something they had just brought in and were able to grind up. They are told that there will be a terrible wailing of the people in the country, and that the people then will send them forth from Egypt. This is a war. This is a battle in which Israel will not really lift a finger, but will get the benefits. And in that sense, we would see that that is the same kind of battle that our Lord wins for us against all the powers of our old sinful nature and the world and Satan himself. Though, of course, that is not all specified right here. We get the benefits. We get all of what God promises. And yet, we want to at least be clear here that what happens with the Passover, even though it will happen once again on the weekend that we call Good Friday through Easter, that the events here are not quite exactly the same, because when Jesus dies, he dies for our sin. And we have nothing here about the sin of the people. We can't call this Easter, even though there are some symptoms of that deliverance, because it was rather easy, if one might say it that way. Not that God would harm Pharaoh and his creatures, for those are his people too. But it didn't take God taking on flesh to be able to deliver Israel from Egypt. It was through the natural events and the hurrying up of a death that would come at some point anyway, and showing that he was God, and when he chose to pull life away through that angel of death, then that would happen, and that he could spare his own people, as had happened with several of the other plagues, so that God was not just in one fell swoop wiping out the firstborn of all. But here then we have this despoiling. The people are picking up the gold and the silver and the jewelry and other possessions of Egypt as if they had won a tremendous victory themselves. There's that old line, to the victors go the spoils. And that is the main reason why a lot of nations gathered people together to go to war. It was simply a very big form of robbing someone. And this is going to be taking place here now, and God says, I will give you, who have been worked hard by these people that have enslaved you, I will now turn the tables, and you will treat them as if they are the slaves. You will take away everything from them that you can. As that's done, then that nighttime, after the instruction has been given about what they are to do, then they actually go ahead and they get the animal ready. They're to stay indoors. The angel of death passes over them and destroys the firstborn. As far as I remember, there is nothing here about a warning to Pharaoh with this one, as had been with some of the other plagues. This just simply happens. We're told about a rather extensive and large number of 600,000 men, plus women and children, plus a rabble that goes along with them. This has caused an awful lot of trouble for people, because it's rather difficult to see the movement of what could be 2 to 3 million people all at once. And there have been a variety of suggestions about that, and about some of the problems with understanding exactly how many years. This 430 years doesn't seem to match up quite exactly with some of the other places. that refer to either 400 years or even 4 generations. Um, some people will take the number 1,000 and recognize that the word Aleph in Hebrew means a chief, and that it might be that in later times the word Eleph, which is the word that we translate as 1,000, maybe meant a family unit at that time, and that it was a much smaller number, even though it would have still been a very significant number of slaves. There's just no way really to know about that, but those who would automatically eliminate the truthfulness of the text because they say that it couldn't be a number that large, there may be some other explanations for that. Um, some of the explanations are more fanciful. I might just mention one. If you take the word B'nai Yisrael, the sons of Israel, and you add up the numbers that later they referred to, the numbers 1 through 9 were like the letters A was 1 through 9, and then after you got to 9, then the next number was 10, and through adding all those numbers together, it is possible that some have come up with from the sons of Israel, and that number exactly within less than 10 of the 603,000. But that's probably something that somebody much later figured out to be able to match it, and not reality there. The Israelites are told that if others want to join with them, if they are circumcised and become part of the covenant people, they can eat that meal as well. And though it is a very difficult thing in our day and age, there is some emphasis on the fact that those who are in that relationship are the ones who partake in the meal. And this would be involved somewhat in our discussions about Holy Communion and those who are communing with the Lord and taking his body and blood. But that's really part of a discussion that is much more appropriate for the New Testament and for some other passages. What we need to look at here is that for Israel as well, there was a command that went with this that said the firstborn of all of the Israelites were also to be, in essence, given to the Lord by offering a sacrifice, both of man and of beast of the firstborn, something that would say that the one who opens the womb would be given back to God, but God allows the people to keep that firstborn and to offer an animal instead. Something on a very, very deep level of saying God is the life giver, and he is really the one who continues to open the womb so that life can go on, and that one would acknowledge the depth of that relationship as the firstborn would be claimed back. Of course, here we've got something that, at least when we do see what happens in the New Testament, is seen in that God treats his own son as one who has not been given back to him, and he causes the death of his own son and says everyone else goes free. In that sense, then that lamb or that goat that would have been offered instead of the firstborn would really have more of a sacrificial role than the Passover lamb whose blood is put on the doorposts and on the lintel. So we have a lot of different little angles on this entire story that are picked up later and are put within the context by the time of Jesus into a setting where he is dying on the cross at the very time that the Israelites are celebrating their deliverance from Egypt. And then once again, a celebration that had been going from times past would take on a new meaning. So very often we have these festivals that have taken place, they get picked up, they're given new meaning, and then that old meaning gradually fades into the background. The events that are taking place here are to be reenacted and to be retold, so that just as Jesus will say, "Do this in remembrance of me," remembering that which I set in motion, so every year the Passover was to be celebrated, and the children were to ask their family then, "What are we doing here? Why is all this taking place?" And then to tell the story of the good news of the deliverance. That really is what worship is. It is a time to be reminded of the great events that have taken place on this earth, where God has acted for our benefit and has delivered us not just from slavery in Egypt, but from eternal death. So In that sense, then, the sacrifice, the giving of an animal instead of the firstborn, is maybe even more of a prefiguring, if you will, of that event which would finally take place on Good Friday, but then be culminated with a resurrection on Easter that broke all the expectations of what Pharaoh and his host ever saw. This is a very significant passage. Of course, it has been picked up by our Lord, who gives it new meaning on Maundy Thursday when he says, this bread, this unleavened bread, now this will convey to you the blessings of what my body is doing. This cup which we drink, one of the four cups that would have been drunk at the Passover meal. The third one is the one usually identified as the one that Jesus refers to. He says, this cup of wine, I will use this to convey the benefits of my blood, which was shed for you. But that's giving it kind of a deeper meaning than what it had before. And in that very simple way, using bread and wine, the very common foods of the time, Jesus then says, this I will now use to convey the full power of what I have done for all of you. Passover is thus very helpful for us to recognize it, but the meaning of the New Testament even goes way, way beyond what we see here. We celebrate, though, as the people did, reflecting on what had already happened and anticipating the future promises. And just as Israel was leaving Egypt and beginning its trek on toward the promised land, so we too are people who have come away from our baptism and from the good news, and as we go through life reflecting on what has happened, we anticipate that time when we too will be with him. As they were able to have a rabble that gathered together and were able to be brought in the covenant, we too are in essence part of that rabble who've been brought in and who now get to look around and encourage others to also come and join with us in the blessings of that deliverance. God's blessings to you, and I hope that you continue to grow in your own study and understanding of the magnificence of God's work in and among us. Thank you.